Hi, everyone, and welcome to Science on the 7th, our live stream series where we talk about issues related to air quality and health and speak with experts from around the world. Today, I'm joining in from Milan, where I was attending a conference on recent advances in air pollution and health. And also, my colleague, Dr. Haneen Khreis, was at this conference um, where she presented some very interesting work on traffic-related air pollution. And that got us talking about how transport and traffic-related air pollution in particular can impact our lives and what kinds of decision making can really help reduce this type of air pollution. So I'm very excited to be speaking with Haneen today. Welcome, Haneen.
Thank you
Uh,
for having me.
Haneen has been working on the topic of transportation and health and air pollution for many, many years now. And Haneen, in the spirit of not destroying your introduction, let me ask you to give us a very quick tour of where you started and what your professional journey has been like.
Sure, and thank you for having me. Happy to be with you today. So I'm a research scientist at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. So I really work in the transportation planning and engineering realm. At the same time, I'm a senior research associate at the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of Cambridge. Very, very different, um, places geographically, but also discipline-wise. But my professional journey has really been at the intersection of these two disciplines, transportation and health. And I actually started as a medic. I started my school in medicine and ended up switching to civil and environmental engineering, but find my way in engineering to go back to public health, which is really where my passion lies. So, from very early on, from my undergraduate degree, I've always been at that intersection between planning and transportation and public health, and I continue to do so.
That is fascinating, and I actually love it. So I'm going to come back to this because we don't hear about a lot of people who make that switch between, starting with medicine and going into engineering and then also connecting it to health, which is amazing. I'm really glad that you're in this space and are able to bring, very different threads together. But you and I have both been in Milan for the last few days. Very interesting city, very historic, but also interesting from the point of view of transportation. And like any other city, there's lots of cars, lots of also people cycling and walking on the streets. So maybe where I want to start today is, in terms of traffic and transportation, it's something that is consistently found across cities around the world. And when we think of transportation as a source of air pollution and something that we need to be paying attention to, what are the types of pollutants that are of interest, and why are we interested in this particular source?
So this particular source is quite important because we live, we work, and play very close to it. So we're in the vicinity of traffic for quite significant chunks of our times, especially when we live in cities. Like you said, we're in Milan now, so just walking around the city, going to get a coffee, or just being in our hotel, or stepping outside for a walk, we're just intersecting with this source all the time. So the exposure is very much, exposure to air pollution is very ubiquitous, full stop. But with traffic, we are in very close proximity to it. And the levels of air pollutants from traffic are very high in the proximity to traffic. So if you're living or you're working or you're walking close to traffic, within 50 to 500 meters, within that region, you have very high levels of pollutants at toxic levels, which are hazardous to human health. So the pollutants we talk about in the context of traffic-related air pollution are some of the same pollutants we talk about with other sources. So, for example, nitrogen dioxide, fine and coarse fine particulate matter in particular, so PM 2.5. But in addition to these pollutants, which are also regulated pollutants, so for example, in the United States, they're part of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So they're regulated, they're routinely monitored, which is a good thing. There are also those pollutants that are not regulated and not routinely monitored, such as black carbon, such as ultrafine particles. But these pollutants now have mounting evidence that they cause adverse health effects. And there is a really strong case, in my opinion, including for things like black carbon, that is building up for their hopefully soon regulation because they do link to a wide variety of health effects. And that evidence is strengthening. So it's a really wide range of different pollutants. And of course, in air pollution epidemiology, we've been, for the most part, focused on these pollutants as singular entities, but in reality, we are exposed to these pollutants together. So really what's happening is we have these multiple pollutant exposures in real life, and they might have synergistic effects so that their combined effect is, for example, higher than the sum of their singular effects. But that is something that we don't fully understand. And for example, our group is working on that particular topic now. And it's really important. And of course, the regulation happens in singularity as well, which is a whole other conversation that we could be having.
Fantastic. So you touched on a few different things which I want to, unpack a little bit more maybe. One is you're talking about black carbon, which is interesting among other things. Also because commonly that is something people will see very easily. Soot is what a lot of people may be familiar with, coming out of tailpipes. And I'm just back from a few weeks in Uganda, where was not uncommon at all to see every few, like after every few vehicles, you'll see one which is just belching out, thick black smoke. And that is true for so many places around the world. And understandably, there's also people that are intersecting with this type of pollution on a daily basis. And I'm thinking about everyone who's, out selling stuff, roadside vendors,
Mm.
in some cases, traffic police officers who are directing traffic and staying in the middle of it for 10, 12, 15 hours a day. Increasingly delivery workers who are
Mhm.
getting stuff to, homes and moving again within traffic a lot. You said we have mounting evidence of a variety of adverse health effects. Could you talk us through some of those health effects that we know traffic-related air pollution has been associated with?
Yes. So, and I mean, the Health Effects Institute special report has looked at these health effects. So I do kind of refer our watchers to that report as well for a more comprehensive view on those associations. But we know now that there are strong associations with mortality, premature mortality, all-cause natural mortality, but also specific endpoints of mortality, specifically cardiovascular disease mortality, respiratory disease mortality, lung cancer mortality. So all these really scary outcomes. And also from, I guess, from a regulatory standpoint as well, these are very important outcomes because they carry a lot of weight when you do any sort of investment appraisal or a cost benefit analysis, for example. So in regulatory assessments and in the past, we've been focused on mortality. But as I said, there is mounting evidence with a wide range of other health effects as well. Specifically, I'm thinking about respiratory morbidity in children. So the development of childhood asthma, which is a topic I've looked at in a lot of detail over the years. So we do see strong evidence between the different pollutants. I just mentioned black carbon, particulate matter 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, and the development of new cases of childhood asthma. And that's really problematic because these cases, childhood asthma is a chronic disease. So once you develop it, you carry it across the life course, and you're having to deal with exacerbations, with changes in quality of life. Your caregivers, really, the cost to society and healthcare services is quite large. And these are things that we do not fully account for in the regulatory assessment in many countries. In addition to respiratory outcomes, which perhaps for many people is kind of intuitive because we're breathing air pollution. So it's going into our respiratory tract and our lungs. There are also systemic outcomes, systemic inflammation that leads to various other health endpoints. So one of the health effects we got really interested in recently was the onset of dementia as well. And I presented our findings in this conference in Milan on the relationship between different pollutants and dementia. And black carbon, for example, also emerged as one of those pollutants with pretty strong associations. I must say that the evidence for black carbon is less developed than PM 2.5 and nitrogen dioxide, but I think in part that's just a matter of having many less studies than those pollutants. So I think that this picture will change in the near future, especially if there are some sort of global guideline values that are introduced for black carbon, or perhaps it's being considered for regulation. People are going to start looking at it. For ultrafine particles as well, we know they're very toxic and they're associated with strong biological mechanisms that can underline many health effects, but the epidemiology is very much not there. So, in short, mortality outcomes, respiratory outcomes, cardiovascular diseases, there is strong evidence with things like stroke, for example, and other cardiovascular outcomes. But also, we have strengthening evidence for neurodegenerative outcomes like dementia and Parkinson's disease. And one of the key takeaway messages from the conference, actually, and it was something that was mentioned in the closing plenary, is that this evidence continues to increase. And every time we're reconvening as scientists, within a couple of years, we see that we have a stronger case and a case that justifies much more action. And really, there's no point in delaying any action to generate more evidence, because the evidence is pretty much there in terms of the need for action, urgent action.
I feel like you're reading my mind because my next question was, I think you queued it up really nicely because yes, there's lots of data, hard evidence, anecdotal evidence, proxy evidence that we can look at to say, transportation is an issue that needs to be, really looked at comprehensively. It has impacts on air quality, it has impacts on health, but I think also just looking at this from a little bit more positive side, there is a lot of good evidence on policies that work and policies that can be useful in reducing air pollution levels associated with transportation or reducing the health impacts. And you've done amazing work on this topic as well, trying to map out what has been studied, which interventions work. So for those people who may be listening and are more interested in, okay, I'm convinced that this is an issue. Now tell me what I need to do or what's going to actually improve this. Can you walk us through some types of examples of interventions that have been commonly introduced in cities and countries around the world and what their impacts or what the results from those types of interventions have looked like?
And yes, before I do that, I do want to get back to the black carbon because you just made me
Mm-hmm.
think about something else related to the
Mm-hmm.
policy realm. So as I said, right now, black carbon is not in many places routinely measured or regulated under air quality standards or guidelines. And
Mm-hmm.
outside of the health effects case that this is important, black carbon and other pollutants, including ozone and ultrafine particles, these are also short-lived climatic forcers.
Yep.
So we're talking about this from an air pollution standpoint, which is our interest and expertise, but there is also a much I don't want to say a much bigger, but there's also a huge other
Mhm.
crisis that we're
Yes.
dealing with in the world and in cities, which is climate change. So
Mhm.
some of these pollutants really offer a very nice and smart opportunity to be tackling these major
Mhm.
planetary crises of air pollution and climate change. And black carbon is one of these pollutants that I think about when I say this. Now, in terms of policies, like you say, the positive thing is we have plenty of options. And we've done the way I got into this work was not from an air pollution standpoint, it was more from a policy option generation for cities standpoint. And what I mean by that is we were just generally looking more at sustainable urban transportation policies, not just for air pollution. Air pollution was one of the goals, but for all sorts of other goals that cities care about, such as being inclusive, being sustainable, reducing congestion, getting to places quickly enough, economic growth, all these different outcomes that different cities look at in their urban mobility planning. And we've done this work at the University of Leeds many years ago, where we've worked also with European cities, and we've realized, and this might sound pretty simple, but it wasn't very clear before we've done these surveys and interacted with those cities. We've realized that a lot of cities do not really entertain the wide range of options they have available. There's really an over-reliance, as we call it, an over-reliance on preconceived ideas, on things that they've done before, on things that they know of, perhaps. But there is much less work on trying to understand and entertain the wide range of options that is available to them, and the effectiveness of these options and the experience from other cities and other perhaps similar contexts. So to look at this issue, a couple of years back, we've done a systematic evidence map. And if you don't mind pulling up that picture with the map to show where the evidence comes from. And just very briefly, for this study, we've systematically reviewed the entire literature. It's slightly out of date already. This was published in 2023. We do want to update it. It also just included the peer-reviewed published literature, so it didn't include the gray literature. And we know from experience that actually cities publish a lot in the gray literature about their own analyses and their own assessments. So there is huge value of looking at the gray literature in the future. But what you can see in this map is where the policies that were aimed at reducing either traffic-related emissions or traffic-related air pollution, where they were studied. And this is aligned with also the evidence on air pollution health effects. We really have many less studies in low and middle income countries. And you can see the frequency of studies in that kind of lower row between 1 and 160. We ended up indexing over 1,000 unique policy intervention scenarios as part of this systematic evidence map, which is also open access. People can look at it. They can look exactly at what these policy intervention scenarios are. One thing we found out as well is that studies tend to study or tend to assess those policy measures in singularity. So what that means is, for example, they would look at what is the air pollution and emissions effect of switching to Euro 5 standards, for example, or Euro 6 standards. So that's one policy measure, quite important. But we also know from experience that policy packages, when you put various measures together in the same package, tend to work better than when you look at policy measures on their own. So what I mean by that is going back to that example of introducing Euro 5 or Euro 6 or Euro 7 now emission standards. Well, what would happen if we do that in a city, in addition to having, for example, congestion charging, introducing additional pedestrian and cycling lanes, making sure that those cycling lanes are separated from traffic. So what happens when we look at those packages together, these policy instruments in a package? Unfortunately, studies look at instruments on their own more than they do in packages. And we'd like to see people assess packages more because, again, there is value in that. They would enable the different policy instruments to work better. They would remove some of the barriers. They can increase public acceptability. And something we'll get back to is they can also improve health outcomes across other pathways and not just air pollution. So, in short, for the policy measures available to reduce traffic emissions and air pollution, there's really a wide range. It's now cataloged in the systematic evidence map, which we're hoping to also update for cities. And mostly it's looking at singular policy measurements, but there are also examples of successful packages where you put these measures together, and the range varies. And if you don't mind pulling that second slide, we can just show some examples of policy measures from around the world. So these are the examples. So we categorize them into 6 categories: pricing, land use, infrastructure, behavioral, technology, management standards and services. And I'm particularly keen on the land use and behavioral policies, and specifically their combination. And some of the key examples that come to mind when I say this is the London's low traffic neighborhoods, the Barcelona super blocks model, because they check multiple of these kind of entry points into reducing emissions and air pollution, and they're not just working on singular pathways and singular issues in isolation. But these are just some examples, from parking charges to road pricing to bus rapid transit to alternative fuel technology, and again, their combination. And cities have access to these measures and information on their effectiveness to really help them in devising their own instruments for their own context. And I do recommend that cities or practitioners who are interested in this look at the systematic evidence map just as a good starting point for that thinking.
I mean, this also raises some really interesting points for cities that may be at that precipice of huge urbanization and development, and making the kinds of decisions that will result in healthier cities and cities where people are not necessarily stuck in traffic, have a better quality of life, easier mobility around. And I'm wondering, if we look to the future, I think there's two types of cities. One where you have these huge cities where interventions can result in changes. But then we also have a very large number of cities, especially in many low and middle income countries that are rapidly urbanizing, where we have a chance to create cities as we would like them to be: healthy, clean, easy to access, and offering something for everybody. So I'm curious, you've said this a few times, it's not only about air pollution, but about the whole set of variables that go along with it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of variables you're thinking about and how they intersect?
And I want to second what you said, and I think for me this is almost like a pain point when I see cities perhaps relying too much on preconceived ideas. The problem with urbanization and motorization, which seems to come hand in hand with urbanization, is that cities can lock themselves in patterns that then become so difficult to change in the future. Like now in many of our American cities, we say, oh, well, the cities are not built for this. Well, sure, they're not built for this. Different story, but there are cities that are currently developing, and we really don't want to build them so that 10 years or 20 years in the future, we say, oh, we can't walk and cycle because they're not built for this. So I think that is really really important, and I'm not sure who to be talking to about this, but maybe you can also go around some of these cities, Valerie, and do some of that really crucial, start some of these crucial conversations. And in terms of, again, we're talking about air pollution, but there are so many other pathways that link transportation to public health outcomes. And if you don't mind, we can pull up the 14 Pathways framework, which we also developed a few years back to communicate the relationships between urban transportation and public health. So what this shows, so air pollution, so I'll start with the figure on the right. So we've conceptualized transportation as the culmination of different factors such as the land use and the built environment, infrastructure, the mode choice, and technologies and disruptors. And these four things interact very much with each other. And what I mean by that is what kind of infrastructure you have in a city will very much dictate your mode choice. And then the prevalent mode choice and the public acceptability and the public appetite for certain modes will very much feed back into the policy of maintaining or creating certain kinds of transportation infrastructure and so on. But these things are what we call, transportation or transportation planning and policy in cities. And these things can alter the levels of different determinants to health. Some of them are beneficial. So the first one that I think about is physical activity, which is very much related to infrastructure, the built environment, and mode choice. So this framework shows the pathways to health, linking these four factors to public health. And if you look at the left side of the slide, you can see those beneficial pathways to health. Those are green space, physical activity, access and mobility independence. We've seen in this review that these pathways have positive health outcomes associated with them. The evidence varies depending on the pathway. So, for example, for physical activity, it's pretty strong. For mobility independence, it's less developed. For green space, it is becoming really strong as well. But also, there are pathways that are detrimental to health, and those are the ones that are shown in the yellow circles. So these include contamination from, for example, water runoff, social exclusion, traffic noise, and we talked a lot about traffic noise also in this Milan conference, urban heat, motor vehicle crashes, air pollution, which we've been talking about, community severance, electromagnetic fields, which is also an underdeveloped field, stress, and greenhouse gases. So all of this to say is whilst air pollution is really important and that's our expertise here, these other pathways are very influential to public health, specifically when we think about physical activity and green space. And if you don't mind pulling the other slide, and I want to show an example of how influential they can be in cities. So if we pull the item outputs. So at the University of Cambridge, our group has been working on a public health modeling tool called ITHM, or the Integrated Transport and Health Impact Modeling Tool. And we've recently developed it specifically for low and middle income countries. So it's been developed by my colleague, James Woodcock, who's worked on it since probably 2013 and applied it across Europe and in England and Wales. And we've recently took that and developed it for low and middle income countries because there is a need for health impact assessments in those regions. And we've done various modeling exercises across various cities, but this is just one of them. And this is in Bogota, in Colombia, where we asked the question, what would happen if 5% of our observed trips, as we saw them in a travel survey in Bogota, what would happen if we switch 5% of our trips to buses, to cars, and to cycling? And we looked at the health impacts of that looking at, in this particular case, all-cause mortality. So this is what I'm showing here. And we found that switching 5% of the trips to cycling in Bogota can prevent about 85 premature deaths per year. If we switch 5% of existing trips to cars, it can cause, I'm trying to see the number. Are you seeing it? Is that 81 additional
Yeah,
or
81 additional
81
deaths.
additional deaths per year?
Mhm.
And if you switch to buses, you can potentially prevent 182 premature deaths a year. So huge benefits. But the other interesting part, which links back to the question you asked, is where do these benefits come from? If we look at the breakdown of these benefits, we can see that most of the benefits are coming from the physical activity pathway. Some benefits from reductions in air pollution, some benefits from reductions in road traffic fatalities, but most of the benefit is coming from getting people to become active by walking from and to their bus stops and leaving their cars behind. This is specific to Bogota. We've done this exercise in other places. The results can look different, but if there is any kind of general take-home message, I would say from these different exercises is that physical activity is huge, and the benefits from switching from motorized transportation to active transportation is usually dominated, not always, usually dominated by physical activity. And those benefits are really large. There's a really good case to do that in many places.
Thank you for sharing that, Haneen. And also, it's interesting because I met a friend for breakfast just this morning, and we were talking about air pollution and what kind of behavior change you bring in order to reduce your exposure. And one
Mm,
of the things he was concerned about was, I'm biking
yeah.
everywhere within the city, and is that good, bad? Should I not be doing it? And our conversation was very similar that actually physical activity benefits will still be very valuable as long as you can maybe find, paths that are not as crowded and with
Mhm.
less traffic, and trying to avoid that, high with the high exposure routes, but still not giving up on the physical activity. So I feel like you are raising such critical points
Mhm.
that we need to be talking about more. And I think as the air pollution community or the air quality community in general, thinking not just about what specifically an air pollution intervention needs to be, whether it's in transportation that we're discussing today, but even other sectors, and trying to interact as much as possible with the broader range of people making decisions about cities and how we move and where we do things that we do. Um, but I know we're also coming close to time. So I want to go back to the very beginning of our conversation where we're starting to talk a little bit about your professional journey, which is fascinating. But I'm also curious, as somebody who was studying transportation planning, there were many, many options available to you, I'm sure, and topics that may have been of interest. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what got you interested in working in air quality. And also, if you can give us one thing that gives you hope for continuing the work and, where we're going to see progress over the next few years.
Yeah, so my interest in air quality really comes from my interest in public health and in improving quality of life and making our societies more livable and more healthy. I think, I really do think health is our most important asset. And I can't think of anything more important. So I think it's a career that has the opportunity to make impact to the most important thing we have. And what gives me hope, I mean, some days I have hope and some days I feel less hopeful. But what gives me hope is that we are indeed seeing positive changes. They are slower than they should be, but I think, that's the general case of science lagging behind policy. I think we do need to focus more on action, train people who are fluent in multidisciplinary science, and being able to go into transportation forums and decision-making forums and planning forums and talk about this evidence and get more of the planners and the stakeholders and the engineers on their side. I think that's what we need to do. And I must say, the other thing that gives me hope is I do see more multidisciplinary scientists and junior researchers emerging. I'm right behind them. But I think that's a big part of the way forward is we need to get people more fluent in these multidisciplinary languages and more confident and empowered to go and talk and bring together stakeholders in coalitions that can make change.
Yeah, I think though I would completely agree with you that the pace of change may not be what we'd like it to be, but I think there's lots of momentum towards the types of decisions that can help us bring healthier cities and just healthier environments for everyone. And I'm hoping that you can continue to motivate many other people to do multidisciplinary work and bring different perspectives into the conversation and dialogue and think creatively about how we can have these impacts, and also continue to produce the wonderful work that you do. But for today, thank you so very much for joining us, and
You.
we look forward to everything you're going to do, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your stay in Milan and safe travels back to the US.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to see you and to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for those of you listening in, thank you for joining. We will be back on April 7th and talking about solutions for clean air action in South Asia. So please join us then. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.